Hello everyone, this is Mizuki Arts. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be going over some tips and tricks on how to use watercolors and gouache. Now you probably have used watercolors in like a classroom as a kid or in like those Crayola pan thingies that a lot of kids have at some point in their childhoods, or at least you've heard of it. But gouache, if you're new to art, you probably haven't heard of at all. It's a very old paint that's kind of in between watercolors and acrylic, in that it can be used in its straight out of the bottle form, which is a little bit thicker, or it can be watered down like watercolors. Before we get started here, I just want to give a bit of a disclaimer. I started out using watercolors, but these days I use gouache a lot more. However, I still consider myself a watercolorist just because I use gouache the way that watercolors are used, and they essentially kind of work the same way. Gouache just kind of allows for a little more flexibility in terms of how thick I want the paint. I just wanted to say that in case anyone was wondering if I had any tips specifically for gouache versus watercolors, but really these tips can be applied both ways just because I'm going kind of general here. I'm going to divide all of my tips into kind of sections, and the first section we're going to go over is how to use watercolors and gouache on a budget. My first tip is prioritize quality paper over quality paints. Now, I'm not even looking at a price point for paints here, just because you can really get away with using any set for watercolors or gouache. My first set of watercolors was a set of tube paints that I picked up at a drugstore for about $7. And likewise, my first set of gouache was a $16 set that I bought from a brand called Artfol, a notoriously cheap and low quality brand. You can really get by with any brand of paint and still have people asking, wow, the colors look great, what brand of paint are you using? And really it just depends on how you're using the paint and of course what paper you're using. I'm not telling you to go out and blow like $50 on a sketchbook, but I am recommending that you take some time and research different sketchbook brands and maybe try a couple before you settle on one that you want to keep working with. I personally recommend Canson because you can get a set of 60 pages in a sketchbook of mixed media paper for about $12, which boils down to about 20 cents a page. If you're looking to use specifically watercolor paper and not mixed media, then you can look into all the different types of watercolor paper. There's hot press and cold press, and of course a variety of brands to choose from, but I do recommend you spend more time looking at good paper than good paints, just because good paints can come with time and price isn't everything. The most important thing is to just have a type of paper that won't warp under the slightest amount of moisture, so definitely get some good mixed media or watercolor paper. Tip number 2 takes less time to explain. It's to use tube paints. There are a variety of gouache and watercolor pan sets. However, I have found that these are hard to maintain and also a lot more expensive to get a nice quality pigment and good amount of paint in them. So I really recommend you get tubes. It also actually makes it easier to mix your own colors in the long run, just because you have everything kind of separated and you're free to build your own palette. This next tip might make me sound incredibly biased, but I promise you it comes from roughly 4 years of practice. Alright, here goes nothing. So I think if you are on a very tight budget but you want some really vibrant paints that you can use as kind of a watercolor medium, I recommend you go with gouache. I just do. I do. This is entirely personal and an entirely personal tip, but right now on screen I'm using gouache, and a lot of people think that I use watercolors more often than gouache, so you can't even really tell the difference, except that the colors are very vibrant, and the set that I'm using retails for about $20, under that actually. I think it said like 17 or something on one site. I especially recommend this if you're someone who's been frustrated with the kind of dustiness that cheaper watercolors can have. I really do recommend you try a cheaper gouache set, just because sometimes the cheaper gouache sets are less dusty and more vibrant and easier to blend than cheaper watercolors, but it really does depend on what brand you get. I'll have the link to the brand that I use down below in the description box. Obviously that tip becomes kind of null if you aren't on like a super rigid tight budget. Both are fantastic mediums and extraordinarily fun to use and learn. Now it's time for my next section of tips, and these tips are going to be all about technique. First up, I recommend you have some patience with letting layers dry. A lot of people use wet on wet for watercolors, but wet on dry is a lot easier to manage, especially if you're a beginner. Personally, I despise wet on wet watercolors. They're just incredibly hard to manage and get the colors where you want, and keep them from kind of becoming a muddy mess. Next up, I really recommend you make use of layers. Watercolor and gouache are not entirely opaque when used in a watered down format, so you can really kind of mix your colors on canvas and have them interact the way that you can play around with layers in a digital art program, or you would have to mix colors separately for acrylics, or kind of hope and pray that the colors layer right with like markers or something. Watercolors and gouache are very versatile in this way, because you can really mix and bend the colors to build an atmosphere right on the paper. For the final tip in this section, I recommend you be really gentle on your brushes. Pick them up between strokes. Don't scrub the paper. It doesn't help your image look better. It damages the paper and it damages your brushes. The final section of tips I'm going to talk about are about accompanying materials like inking pens and like paper types. Tip number 1 in this section is to always use alcohol-based pens. Pens can be both alcohol-based and water-based, and they can be used in different circumstances. Water-based are typically cheaper, and they can be used with things like alcohol markers a lot easier, but they should never be used with watercolor paints or gouache, simply because the paint will make the pen bleed, and that's just a mess. So definitely check and make sure you are using an alcohol-based pen if you're doing the inking before the painting part. Some people do colors before they add line art, which is fine, in which case you can use any type of pen that you want. This next tip is about paper types and discerning between the two. For watercolor paper, there are two main types. There's hot press and there's cold press. Hot press has a lot more texture, while cold press is a little smoother. I've worked with both. I have no preference between the two, and I usually go for the Canson mixed media paper simply because it's cheaper and it works well for my purposes. However, I do highly recommend that you try out a variety of types and brands of paper. And my final tip is to avoid the types of brushes that come with your typical kids watercolor pan sets, because they are either too plasticky, hard and rigid and will like leave little scratches in your paper, or are so soft that they can't really move the like pigment particles in the watercolor or gouache around on your paper. So definitely do some research on different brush types, and go to even like your local Walmart and pick up some like acrylic paint brushes, because those seem to work really well. If you made it this far into the video, I want to say thank you so much for watching. Good luck on your watercolor and gouache endeavors, and if you enjoy this type of content, be sure to like and subscribe, you know, all that stuff, because we're close to 200 subs, which is really exciting, and I want to thank you guys for being here, and I'll catch you guys next time. Bye!